So here's a couple of quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, 2007. In Africa, quote, by 2020, between 75 and 250 million people are projected to be exposed to an increase in water stress due to climate change. Heating up the landscape, arid regions in Africa are going to get more arid, most likely, and it's one thing to talk about decreased crop production in the United States, which could cause a lot of problems, but in Africa and the Sahel, decreased crop production could translate into tens of millions of people starving. Okay? Similarly, in Asia, in coastal regions, we have very heavily populated megadeltas, only a few meters above sea level. As storms get more powerful and as sea levels rise, millions, again, tens of millions of people could be at risk for death or displacement due to this. So, climate change is a danger. Next slide. And we can talk about some of the dangers closer to home here. You're Coloradoans, you travel around the state. You've seen our dead or dying forests, literally millions of acres now. Scientists at my university, Colorado State, have connected these dying forests up to climate change. We're warming and drying out our forests, and we're killing them off in many places. Next slide. We're also changing the fire regime, partly because we're killing off the forests. So we can expect more frequent, more powerful fires, including in places that we've developed. So there are dangers to what we're doing here. Some amount of climate change has already happened. Some further amount is already in the pipeline. Next slide, please. Our choice is not about whether or not to prevent climate change. It's too late for that. It's not about whether or not to adapt to it. We're going to have to adapt to some degree of climate change, whether we believe it or not. Our choice is whether to work to limit climate change or continue with business as usual and accelerate it. Now, when I think about this, by the way, how am I doing on time, John?
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay, perfect. When I think about climate change, I think about my children and other future generations around the globe. I think we have a moral responsibility to limit climate change in order to protect future generations. Next slide. I also think we have a responsibility to be good stewards of the habitat and resources that other species need for their very existence. So hopefully you all recognize one of our fellow citizens here in Colorado, the little pika, little alpine rabbit, threatened by climate change. So there are many other species besides this pika that are threatened by extinction by climate change, and for that reason too, I think we should work to limit climate change. Fortunately, there are things that we can do to reduce the climate change coming down the pike. Next slide. We can build more fuel-efficient buildings and automobiles. We can switch to renewable energy. We can work to cut back on our energy demands as well. We can also work to end human population growth in the United States and worldwide in order to reduce humanity's energy demands and help us make a less bumpy transition to more sustainable ways of life. Okay, what's the connection between population growth and global climate change? Next slide, please. According to the IPCC, it's really quite clear. Between 1970 and 2004, global population increase accounted for about 40% of the increase in worldwide carbon emissions. It's kind of simple. Climate change is being driven primarily by increased use of fossil fuels. If you have more people, all else being equal, we're going to use more fossil fuels and we're going to emit more carbon. Next slide. So for instance, in the United States, these are figures from the US Energy Information Administration. In the US between 1990 and 2003, per capita emissions of greenhouse gases only increased 3.2%, but our total emissions increased more than 20%. Why the discrepancy? Well, in that time, our population increased by a little over 16%. That accounted for about 4/5 of the increase during that time in the United States. Next slide. We can also look at Colorado. Here's a quote from the Colorado Climate Action Plan of 2007. By volume, greenhouse gas emissions from human activity in Colorado grew by 35% from 1990 to 2005. But the report goes on to say that wasn't because people were using 35% more energy on average. It's because our population grew by close to that. So the US population quadrupled in the 20th century. Next slide, please. Currently, our population is growing by about 1% annually, a rate that if it continues will double our population over the next 70 years. That's going to make it much more difficult to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we'll probably have to run real hard just to stay in place if we double our population during that time. If instead we took steps to stabilize our population, non-coercively, we would make it much easier to achieve significant emissions reductions. And that's the path I think we should take. Now, my last point before I turn it over to Robert, how important is immigration to US population growth? Well, next slide, please. The answer is it's very important. This is a slide of US population currently in 2000 and up to 2100, projections out to 2100. And as you can see, hopefully on this slide, as we increase population rates, that greatly increases the total population we'll have in 2100. American fertility rates are right around replacement rate, and they have been for around 4 decades. So with zero net immigration, the US population would rise over the next 4 decades. Here we are, a little over 300 million people. At zero net immigration, we increase to about 360 million, and then we slowly decline. But for each 500,000 more people we allow to immigrate into the United States, you can see it changes the trajectory. At 500,000 annual immigration, we instead hit 415 million. At 1 million annual immigration, we'll hit 486 million. And if we go to 2 million annual immigration, as we might under comprehensive immigration reform, we instead hit 629 million people in 2100. Now, I would put it to you that that's going to make a huge difference for the whole range of environmental issues, including greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So let me just throw 3 more scenarios out here for you. The middle scenario here is basically our current immigration policy. We allow in about 1.25 million immigrants annually net. And at that rate, we're set to almost double our population by 2100, from about 315 million today to 524 million. And just as important, you see the trajectory we'd be on in 2100 for further growth. If we go to a more expansive, comprehensive immigration reform, as our 2 senators from Colorado have proposed, we will instead, let's imagine, increasing immigration to 2.25 million annually. Well, we're going to hit 669 million, and again, increasing. If, on the other hand, we decreased immigration, which would be my proposal, to about 250 million annually, you see that puts us on a trajectory to increase for a while. We digest the last baby boom, and then we could stabilize our population at about 380 million people annually. I think that's a more responsible policy. I think it would be good for nature. It would also be very good for human beings. I think it would be the right policy from a stewardship position. It would be the right policy from a concern for future generations. To conclude then, I think there are numerous good reasons, environmental, economic, and social, for reducing current, what I would call excessively high immigration rates. I think Americans' responsibility to help limit global climate change provides particularly strong reasons for this position. But I expect that Robert Zubrin will have a different take on this, so I think it's time to let him have his say.